We have all had painful events in our lives that can lead to depression, anxiety, addiction, or broken relationships. But here's a secret. It is not about what happened to us that causes suffering. It's the stories we believe about ourselves. Join us as we shine light on how to rewrite our stories, avoid the shadows of shame, and travel along the pathway to joy, love, and connection. It's the Finding Peace podcast with your host, Amazon best-selling author, Troy L. Love.
Hello, and welcome to the Finding Peace podcast. I'm really excited to spend the next little while with you. I have a special guest who will be joining me, and I'm going to be introducing her in just a moment. But before we do so, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the upcoming Finding Peace retreat that's going to be held in Prescott, Arizona. We had to cancel the last two Finding Peace retreats because of COVID. We were getting ready to host the next one in March of last year, and then everything kind of collapsed all around us. We scheduled another one in September, hoping that the epidemic would have been calmed down by then, and obviously it didn't. So we really decided whether or not we were going to do the Finding Peace retreat again this year. We recognize that the CDC is recommending that people who are at risk not get into larger groups. We are going to be doing everything in our power to keep everyone safe. Because we're doing it up in Prescott, it's beautiful. A lot of what we'll be doing at the retreat then it will be outdoors as much as possible so that people will be able to enjoy being in the outdoor sunshine, beautiful scenery that's in Prescott, Arizona. I'd like to play just a little clip from one of the previous participants, Philip, as he shares what his experience was like at the Finding Peace retreat. And then you can learn more about the Finding Peace retreat by going to troyllove.com.
Hello, my name is Philip Sestar. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I came to the Finding Peace retreat from a friend's recommendation. I have struggled with self-worth value, just not believing in myself, not having a very strong self-worth. And through this 4-day intensive, was taken through a number of exercises that helped me to understand just how valuable I am, that I'm not alone in my life, that we all make mistakes, and that we are all beautifully broken and we can be healed and helped. And so I highly recommend this retreat and Troy Love.
If you'd like to join us at the Finding Peace retreat, again, go to troyllove.com for more information. I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Power. She is the CEO of EPower and Associates, and I have to tell you, she is a delightful individual. You're going to hear her amazing story as I had the opportunity to interview her. Elizabeth is a sought-after speaker, facilitator, teacher, and consultant. All she does is help people with change, resilience, and self-care. That's exactly what we do here at the Finding Peace podcast. And she does it from the trauma-informed lens, the trauma-informed perspective. And I think you're going to love hearing her story. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Power. I have with me an amazing individual, Elizabeth Power, and I am so humbled that she would be willing to spend some time with me. You're going to get to know her a little bit more as we do this podcast. And Elizabeth has some great experience with trauma-informed care and helping people change their lives. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a little while, you know that that's what Finding Peace is all about, trying to help people change their lives. So, Elizabeth, I am so honored and grateful that you'd be willing to hang out with me for a little while.
Oh, Troy, you're just the best. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure and delight to get to help people find peace. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to sit with you on this podcast, is because I think If there's anything I wish we could do, I mean, yeah, I'm an old hippie. World peace, it's important.
Right? It
It
totally
starts
is.
with individuals.
It does.
It's not world peas either.
Exactly. Well, thank you. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got started in the world of transformation and trauma informed care?
Mm-mm-mm. Yeah, buddy, I sure can. Trying to make my own life make sense. I think almost every one of us who ends up in the world of the helping professions, whether it's education or counseling, we're almost always working on something in ourselves that we hope we can also heal and correct in the work we do. And for me, it's the same story, although I've taken a different bent or a different twist with it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I can, if as listeners to the podcast attest, I talk a lot about the importance of doing our own work, but the whole reason why I'm here is because I had that similar journey of having to discover how to recover from traumatic experiences and find
Mhm.
greater peace. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that journey? What that looked like
Well,
for you?
sure. I'm happy to. I think the first thing I want your audience to know is that when we talk about things that overwhelm people, those events we call traumatic, it's much more important to look at the impact than it is at the name of the event.
Hmm.
I remember a long back about, oh God, I'm an old toot. Let's see. The diagnosis of PTSD was a blessing when it hit the books in 81 or 82. And I was working with a social worker at the time who had the good sense to know what she was looking at and stamp, there went that one. And let's start with those because we all think the first thing we think, partly because of the way language has evolved, is we think about abuse and neglect when we think about trauma. We miss that anything that so overwhelms anybody, regardless whether they're really short or really tall, that they can't cope is what the brain processes as traumatic. And for me, I remember arguing for my own health, which is a hard thing to do in a clinical setting, because then you run into clinicians' beliefs and their prejudices and the clinical illusion and all of those things. But everybody kept saying, you must have been sexually abused to have this. I'm like going, well, yeah, later on, but I don't think that's the beginning. I think you're looking at an effect rather than a cause. It's like I had to really fight for my own health there, because most of the things that were the real root cause of the challenges I faced were things that were very ordinary for the times. Back in the 50s, as now, when young men got out of the military, it was far more young men than young women then. They would get a job, the boss would promote them, and they would have to move. And that was simply the way it was. And so we moved a great deal before I was 2. Your clinical head should be going attachment, because that's a good place to head. Now, again, we think of people who have difficulties with connecting with other people as having had issues with abuse and neglect. There were no perpetrators in that moment. Then my father died of cancer before I was 3. Again, there are no perpetrators there.
Right.
But this prompted my mother to have to move back to rural Western North Carolina, where she wasn't really exactly welcome or necessarily wanted, because when kids left the farm, they didn't exactly get welcomed home when they came back. And mercy, she had red fingernails in Appalachia, and this just did not work well. Then I had rare diseases, which put me on phenobarb for like 6 weeks, and I was out of my body on a regular basis. Probably the greatest relief I ever had. And then I developed an orthopedic disability that was congenital, that caused my knees and my hips and my shoulders. Every major joint dislocates. I can sneeze and throw body parts around the room, brother.
Oh my goodness.
But as a child, when I finally was able to look at it from everybody else's point of view, they all held their breath around me, because they weren't certain when I was going to fall on the floor screaming because a kneecap was out of place. So you got to understand, now it could have been homelessness. It could have been natural disaster. It could have been other medical crises. It could have been. And those things all set me up because they made me invisible to adults, which meant I was the perfect prey for every predator. But you don't solve these issues by looking at the perfect prey for every predator. You solve them by looking backwards and see, where did I get stalled out developmentally? And this was something that I had to fight for in my own healing.
Yeah, one of the premise of the work that I do, I call them attachment wounds, and you
Mm-hmm.
identified two of them, abandonment and abuse, but loss is the first one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And everything you just talked about, there are no perpetrators with that wound.
No.
It's just the part of life that
Yeah.
is difficult, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt, and it's not.
That's correct. It doesn't mean that it doesn't cause you, again, your developmental age. I was like 2.5 when my father died. So, of course, I thought I was responsible for his death for about 35 years. I mean,
Right,
that's what kids that age do.
right.
And so pathologizing what is normal became an issue because I saw so much effort spent on making me sick
Mm-hmm.
and not much effort on helping me get, quote, better. And I remember the day that I said, if I were better, how would my life be different? And I don't think this is a question that gets asked often enough.
Mm-hmm.
If I were better, how would my life be different? And I realized, well, I'd still be making a living. I'd have friendships that lasted a long time. I would be able to tolerate the discomfort of my own life as I waddle through it. Because that's one thing we don't develop a lot is the ability to tolerate discomfort, which is
Mm-hmm.
necessary in all of life. I've never seen a baby that came out and said, "Oh, oh, oh, let me go back in and do that again. Wow, that was fun." And I'm pretty sure that the caterpillar that turns into goo inside the cocoon doesn't think too much of that when they emerge a butterfly if they remember it.
Right.
So I began very early on, long before trauma-informed care was ever a phrase, to say to people, if you don't like what I've become, then you need to not like what happened to me, the ordinary things and the extraordinary things.
Oh, I love that.
Because and I actually had the nerve to say that on Montel Williams back in 92, because back in 90, after about 13 people died in my life at one time, and I'd become sort of a public figure talking about helping people cope with change in the corporate world, I was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder, as it was called back then.
Mm.
And it was a perfectly appropriate diagnosis, but it's not one I expected. But, growing up in the South, we believe in eccentricity. And we have a lot of different models for a lot of different things. And I thought, well, okay, this is not what I expected. Meet new people, make new friends. I've had all this help all this time. How can I help these parts of me that have been so useful and necessary heal at the same time I go forward in my life?
Mm.
And I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I understand the Trinity. So it was like, okay, if the Trinity works for Creator, why doesn't it work for me?
Yeah.
And I began to let's look at the functional elements here, which are, if the communication amongst the different parts of the self is harmonious, if you have an absence of excess conflict, and then that's a good thing. If you have the absence of excess personalization of one state over the other, well, that's functional. And if you have an age-appropriate level of sharing of information across states, that's functional. So I said, look, if I'm functional, what's your problem? And I basically kind of, like the mouse performing the last great act of defiance against the hawk, continued to work, was never hospitalized, got my master's degree at Vanderbilt in the process, quadrupled my income, and kind of said, let's take a look at this phenomenon. Can you have this and not be crazy? The answer is yes. Now, I don't think I'm able to be diagnosed with much of anything anymore, except maybe COVID stress. And sometimes my PTSD gets a little D if I'm locked in the house too long. But, it was a remarkable experience. I wouldn't have volunteered for it, but since I found myself there, it seemed like, well, make something out of it.
I love that. That's that magic wand questions that sometimes I ask my clients. If I had magic wand, it could change one thing in your life. What would be different about you? And then I say, it's not the bad things that have happened to you. It's the stories we've wrapped ourselves up with about those things. If we can change the story, it's different. And that's exactly what I'm hearing you do.
Preach it, brother. Change the story, change your life. Absolutely. I arrived in Nashville in 1979 as a shoe repairer. I've got great stories about that. I put rattlesnake toes on Alabama's boots, and I fixed Minnie Pearl's little blue overnight case, and I fixed Oprah Winfrey shoes. It was the shop I worked in, and I was very good at it. And I thought that was all I could do because I had convinced myself that I was stupid. because I couldn't do math.
Mm.
And for some reason, the story that I told myself was, if I can't even balance a checkbook, how can I possibly hold a reasonable job? You know, and when I begin to help people look at the stories they tell themselves and begin to say, well, how might that have been a strength?
Right.
That my inability to work with numbers effectively back then meant that I became extremely overdeveloped in the area of words. And that's okay. I've made a grand living for the last 30 years doing instructional systems design and transformational change work.
Right.
I decided about 3 months ago, yeah, I think I can read numbers again now, you know, and I'm reading.
That's so wonderful. This is beautiful.
Thank you.
You said a few minutes ago that you had to fight for your own health care, or you had to fight. Can you say more about that?
I will. Please try not to be offended. It's a hard thing to say. There are many clinicians, and I've fired a bunch of them, who are more invested in the models that they paid an awful lot of money to learn. And that's important to understand. Every clinician who goes through training learns certain models and certain ways of thinking that are associated with their profession. Part of that means expecting your nice job as your young, attractive, verbal, intelligent, usually white client. But there is, no matter how you cut it, an underlayment of the economy in mental health care. For example, and I hate to say this, you can't make a living if people don't need you.
Right.
Just like I can't make a living if people don't need me. That one simple fact means that there's, at a very unconscious level, some resistance to people getting better, because if they get better, then you have to change clients. And you have to do all of that work to get back to the same place again, to be able to do the really deep work that needs to be done. There are a couple of issues with that. One is that it automatically supposes that people with very different histories who might have the same diagnosis react the very same way to the very same stuff. I had to argue with that there's the phenomenon that's been researched. It's called the clinical illusion. It says that if you have seen people with, for example, dissociative disorders, that, you know, the name got changed to DID a while back. So if you see people who have DID, you have an expectation of how they behave and how they look and how they function and how they act. And if you've been seeing people who are having a really, really hard time, the time when somebody comes in like me who's I'm doing okay, I need to do some work on some stuff, but I'm okay here. You can't believe that. You can't believe that they're doing that well, because they don't fit your expectation based on the people you've already seen. So for people who work with folks with schizophrenia or psychosis or other manifestations of great challenges in their lives, if they don't fit the requirement, the clinical world assumes that they are even sicker than they said they were, or that they're in denial. There's even a term that we use to describe people who refuse to take their medicine because they don't have adequate insight. But here's the challenge. We don't say that about diabetics or people who are hypertensive who won't take their medication. So the double standard insists that we be ill when in fact we may have a great deal of health. I promise you, if there's a natural disaster or a terrorist attack in this country, the people with the longest, most profound histories of chronic issues that have caused them to seek support will know what to do, but not everybody else.
Right. Amen.
They know the support systems. So, you know, getting people to let me be healthy. I remember a time when somebody said, well, maybe you need to live in a group home. And I said, that'll be the day when it freezes over. That'll be the day. You know? And, but again, if you are desperate for relationship, if you haven't much success, and if the self is not, if you have a sense of self that is injured, it's sometimes easier to take what other people tell you you must be and incorporate that than it is to fight for your own health. You have to be willing to be labeled non-compliant, treatment resistant. I've been told I was too sick to get better. I've been told I didn't want to get better. And you have to be willing to fight those things. Now, it would be easy for me to go off on the clinicians who said those things. And I also know, as much as I resent the behavior, they too were doing the best they could.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure some of them had any business being in the business.
No.
You know, so that's what I mean.
I'm sad that you had to go through that.
It's all right. It helped me get to here, and that's the whole thing is I had the good sense not to believe the lies. That was the most important thing.
Yeah, those stories, I tell you, the stories get pounded into our heads, and it's so hard to rewrite that narrative.
Yes, and I think it's a real challenge for clinicians and clients both, and for anybody. If you've never even seen a therapist and you decide to change your story, I have to tell you, it's a matter of little choice by little choice, stacked on top, choice on top of choice, on top of choice, just making the choices over and over and over again. And if you find yourself away from a choice that's important to you, going back to it.
Right.
It's stacking choices.
One of the questions a lot of people ask me is, how do you rewrite those stories? How do you do that? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or how you answer that question when people ask that.
I ask people when they say, how did you rewrite your story? I say, well, how comfortable are you being uncomfortable? Because anytime that you go through change, we know that all trauma is change, but not all change is traumatic. And when you look at the simple dynamics of how change affects us, it feels pretty yucky. I remember the very first time I sat down in front of a computer, and it was a black and an amber screen. And every time I hit the wrong button and go, and I would think, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm too stupid to live, and I would shrink down in my seat and I would go, and in reality, all I was doing was learning a new skill, but I felt angry and irritated and frustrated and deficient and defective and frightened, and all of those negative things that we feel with change. If you're going to rewrite your story, getting comfortable with those as markers of change is the first step. To realize just because these are the feelings doesn't mean they're the facts. All I was doing was learning a new skill. That was the fact. And in truth, the first time I stood up to a clinician and said, I don't think so, which was probably developmentally appropriate for me in terms of my healing, I thought I was going to die. I already figured, can't do that, And now I teach clinicians. Isn't that interesting? But learning to recognize that it's easier to get stuck in the things that we miss, the pity, the sympathy, the comfort, the attention, the care that comes with being in failure. We all have a need for those things, certainly for the sympathy and the comfort and the attention. And when we get used to those coming as a result of being victims and living out the victim personality, or being injured or being less than, almost like a dog rolling over to show us its belly, we miss out on the self-respect and the self-esteem and the responsibility and the access we can have. But to get to those states, those positive benefits of the success we create, we have to go through change. And it still feels really, really weird. So getting used to being comfortable in discomfort's the first thing. And I think the next thing is recognizing what is the life you want. I wanted to own a home. I wanted to have successful employment. I wanted to make a difference in the world I was in, because I saw early on that the real goal is to reduce the time and the trauma and the cost of healing for everybody, clinicians and clients. And looking at how does change play into that became a big issue for me. So I leveraged change to realize I'm really good at a lot of things. I'm really good at writing. I'm really good at teaching. Now I'm going to become a teacher. And the first time I thought about that, I'm like going, oh my God, no. My mother was a teacher. My sister was a teacher. I'd rather be nibbled to death by ducks than teach for a living. And when I realized I love to help people learn, that's what I love. Then I was comfortable becoming an educator.
And speaking of that, you wrote I'm sure you've written more than one book. You wrote a recent book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. Look, there's never going to be enough clinicians in the world for the people who need to be supported. Over 24 million prescriptions for sertraline got written in 2018. Half of those could have probably done with therapy or counseling and exercise, but there'll never be enough people to see people twice a month if you just take 12 billion of those.
Right.
And so I crosswalked social emotional learning skills, which is what we teach kids, with emotional intelligence, which are the same skills, And we surveyed 4,000 clinicians online last year and said, how would it be? What would happen to your work with people if they came in with higher levels of these? Self-awareness, all of those skills. And it was universally be much easier. So I began to look at how can I create the tools that can come with increasing your emotional intelligence and strengthening the self. It's Kohut's work on the self capacities, and basically, and bridged. And so now write about emotional intelligence through a trauma informed lens, so that people can access the content without having to own being clients or the stigma of seeking mental health care, but can actually look, if I mastered these skills, then it will help me at work and it will help me at home. So we talk about managing feelings and how you do that, some ways to learn to do that. We talk about those interconnections we have to others that we can use. And so it's an easy read. People like it. It's the first in a series of 5. And it's been a lot of fun to work with.
What is one of the key principles that people could take away from to help them manage their emotions?
Wow, I'll tell you the one that's been most useful to me today. I've been dealing with some stuff with bookkeeping. The number stuff, there's that thread.
Right.
And when I find my anxiety rising because I'm dealing with something mathematical, and I hear myself saying, but I don't do numbers. I can't add and subtract and divide and multiply. I think, wait a minute. You wrote a paper in college on the relationship between the Fibonacci formula and Pascal's triangle as evidence of determinism in nature. You have a black belt. You are a 6 Sigma black belt. How does it help you to believe that? And so I don't say, how can you lie about it? How does it help me to believe that I can't do those things? It keeps me from dealing with the anxiety that rises when I look at numbers. These interconnections are key, Troy. Let me ask you a question. On your cell phone, do you have pictures of people and things that you love or hate?
People I love, things I love.
And when you're feeling stressed, do you ever pull out your cell phone and look at those pictures?
Yeah.
And does it make you feel better?
Yes.
There you go. So beginning to catalog all of the connections that we have that we can use to help us self-soothe, even though the way we might do that today is different than we did when I was a child, it's still very valuable. Family recipes. I'll bet you've got one.
I have a couple. I do.
Imagine having a potluck with people who bring their favorite family recipes and everybody tells the stories. Those interconnections that we can call on when we soothe are present even for us in the worst of times. I would say that Viktor Frankl capitalized on them.
Oh,
tremendously.
Absolutely.
The songs, the playlists, the clothes that we wear because there's something somebody gave us, the jewelry we have that big rock that you got in the DIVORCE, you might wear that just because you got the big rock. But basically, what are the everyday reminders that we have? Transitional objects in social work theory, but interconnections in self-psychology.
That's so beautiful. That is absolutely one of the primary things about finding peace. I tell people we're wired for connection.
And dude. Yeah.
We are wired. So how can we foster those connections, remind ourselves of those connections, build those connections? Beautiful.
Here's an example. Your first name is Troy. I have a cousin named Troy Cannon that I hadn't thought of in years when I saw your name. I wonder how Troy's doing. I can go out and look up and see if Troy's on this side or the other. We had a band director named Mr. Love. So when I connected with you, automatically my brain began to go back to these connections
so
that are positive.
Yeah, so beautiful.
It's easy. You don't have to pay $65 an hour to learn that.
I wish that more people knew that skill, though.
That's why I did this. We've got to get these skills out, because imagine that I came to you and I don't have these skills. We have to start from such a different place.
Right.
But if I have some of these skills, if I've expanded myself so that I can tolerate, it's like if I come to you only able to hold 3 ounces of glasses cleaner and I need to be able to hold 33 ounces, I'm in trouble. Because every time my cup runs over, I'm going to be dysregulated. I'm going to be freaked out. I can't think. I can't function. So strengthening the self is the key work that's so important to make it easier for everybody. We don't have evidence-based protocols are sweet, but they are often used at the expense of relationship. If we're going to degrade the clinical process so that we don't have the 45 or 50 sessions that we need to really build that deep relationship to do the deep work, we have to help people prepare for doing the deep work with less front end time.
Absolutely.
And that's what this does.
I'm excited to go read it.
Ooh, cool. I love it. I love it.
Thank you. It's beautiful. The work that I talk about, I often talk about the shadows of shame, which we don't need to get into, but those external, but they feel internal messages that say we're not enough and life is awful. And I talk about the way that you combat that is just what you talked about, connecting with my core truth, my core influence, my core light, and my core love. Connecting with that just blows the shame away and helps me be able to reach out and connect with people. So I'm excited to read more about these tools. Thank you so much for writing the book.
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. And there are more coming. The next one, I surveyed my audience and I said, what do you want next? Do you want changing lenses or claiming culture? And so I'm doing changing lenses first, and I expect that'll be out in May or so. But, you know, it's just time in my life to take the knowledge that I have and to put it into a form that everybody can access in a different way. I've enjoyed teaching. I'm working with Japan on a national model for trauma-informed care that's culturally appropriate right now. And I've had some real wonderful experiences helping folks look at how does my European culture contradict or complement indigenous and Afrocentric culture relative to social process. And I think the thing I'm saddest about these days is that in terms of the stereotypical European culture, it's not really healthy. Competition, individual over others, self over others. And those are the underpinnings of all the theories we have in psychology right now, except Jean Baker Miller's work on relational psychology. And I just think we have to figure out different ways of being more human with each other and of tending our own and each other's injuries and of helping people develop the skills so that we have less risk of injuring each other. It's generational.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a trip.
It's a beautiful work you're doing too.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
I didn't, like I said, I didn't volunteer for it, but when it became obvious it was my job, I decided to show up.
I'm so grateful you did.
Thank you.
Yeah. I am so grateful for the time you were willing to spend with me today and share a little bit of your story. As you were telling me that you had been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, I've only met one other person, and that person did a similar thing with that diagnosis as you and figured out how to move on with their life. So it's interesting, the narrative I have about people who have dissociative, it's not the narrative that you would have learned in school. It's like, you can deal with that. You can work through it. So it's wonderful that you were willing to be vulnerable and share that part of your story. And it just, to me, says we don't have to be entrapped by the stories and the stories we tell ourselves and the stories other people tell us about us. We can find our own truth and live it.
Well, we can. And there are some really funny jokes about that. I remember when the DSM-5 came out, and one of my colleagues who's a clinician said, well, I guess you're a did now. I said, well, you know what? I might be a did because I got done to, but when I get done, I'll be a done did. And we laughed and hooped it up. You know, I think, do you know Frank Putnam's work on state dependent? Go out and look up Frank Putnam, Putnam. His most recent book on state dependent learning and self is really a remarkable text. There's a large community of people who are plural, the plural community. And what many of us have found is that the degree to which the people around us buy into what they expect us to be, which is either functional or dysfunctional, dramatically influences how we function. And those are expectations that need to be shifted by everybody. But, you know, it's an interesting phenomenon. The other challenge we have is, as with any diagnosis, if I say I never had it, if I don't own it, and be comfortable talking about it, then I'm in denial or dissociation.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the minute you get a diagnosis, you're labeled with a stigma badge the rest of your life.
That is one of the things I hate the most. And when I'm having somebody inside, I have to give them the diagnosis so that we can bill their insurance.
Right.
And yet I'm like, I just need you to know that I don't see you as this label. I see you as a human being. I hope that you can know that. And I hate it. Sometimes I want to figure out how in the world can I do that without having to give you a freaking label.
Well, that's why I went into education. Back in the 90s, my master's degree I got in 97. And I thought, I'm not willing to label and judge people. If these are the natural consequences of things that happen to folks, even now we're seeing in schizophrenia and in psychosis that these are predominantly caused by experiences that overwhelm people. I'm not saying there's not a biological component, but it's a chicken and egg thing. If these are the natural consequences of life as we live it, then what is the reason we're pathologizing the normal?
Amen. Right there.
Yeah. So, and I'll come talk to you anytime you want to talk. You know that.
Appreciate that.
We have a loyalty statement here that goes as long as if I've got a biscuit, you've got half. So just know that I'm here with you.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I love your light. I love your gift. I love what you've done with the journey that you've been on, and your willingness to share your truth and your insights with us. Thank you so much for spending some time with me.
You're deeply welcome. And if folks want to get a look at who I am, they can crank right out to elizabethpower.com and find me there. And you can find my work, my book on Amazon. I will tell you a funny story. Or on Apple Books. There's a woman named Elizabeth Power who is a romance novelist in the UK. Honey, let me tell you. And when I put the book into district, and I knew she was there, I've run into her a couple of times before. She's very gifted at writing romance novels, but I'm not a steamy writer. And so here's my little book on trauma and on strengthening yourself and getting your stuff together and making it in a little pile and everything. And underneath it, also by Elizabeth Power. And here are the steamy romance novels. I'm like,
That is awesome. Oh, that's funny.
Live, laugh, and love.
That's right. Hey, that's part of how we survive this world. So,
Isn't it though?
Well, Elizabeth, you are a joy, and I am so grateful that you were willing to spend some time with me, and so grateful for the work you do and the influence you have in people's lives to help them rewrite those narratives and change. And thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And Troy, thank you for what you do, because the challenges you face are many, and the work that you do is profound, and we need more of it. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks. You too.
You've been listening to the Finding Peace podcast. If you loved the show or want to ask a question, let us know by going to troylove.com. There, you can also learn about the Finding Peace 5-Day Challenge. Remember to subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss the next episode. And if you are listening on iTunes, please give us a 5-star rating. It helps other people find this podcast more easily. Thank you for spending part of your journey with us. Copyright Finding Peace Consulting.